Chair Kelly, you are free to call the meeting to order, and then we will move into roll call.
All right. Well, we'll officially do that then and call everything to order. Let's go ahead and start the roll call. Who's going to do that today? I think we're starting to have a little bit of summer doldrums here with the people not coming in person. If y'all knew who didn't show up, how great the food was today, you'd have made a bigger effort to come in.
All right, we'll get started with roll call. Richard Farias, Lawson Picasso, Diana Martinez, Frank Gonzalez, Cliff Soloway, Raquel Zapata. I'm not Raquel. You're not Raquel. Adelita Cantu, John Kelly, Tom Corser, Vanessa Alvarado.
Present.
Mary Dennis, Bill Day, Andrew Clapsaddle, Steve Bonnet,
Here.
and Bob Zapata. Mr. Bob Zapata. We do not have a quorum at this time.
How short are we on the quorum?
2 members.
2. Okay.
We will not be voting on any items today, sir, so that will not impact any of the operations of the meeting.
We can move the approval of the minutes to next month.
Okay. Okay. All right. I guess we best do that then. Okay. Well, I've been looking forward to a report on the outcome of the legislative session. And I think, if I understand correctly, at least for now, the special session that's been called doesn't affect our power and grid issues. I'll stand corrected if I'm not right. And but we never know what other special session we may see coming up. So anyway, I guess at this point, Yvonne, we'll turn it over to our representatives.
All right, then we will go ahead and move into our first briefing for today. You will recall back in, I want to say January, we had the government relations team here to give you all a briefing on what was anticipated for the legislative session just before it convened, as well as what was anticipated to occur with ERCOT and the PUC relative to energy market reform. So we do have a few members of our team back to give you a briefing on the outcomes, of both endeavors, if you will. And so we'll go ahead and turn it over to Carrie Meyer, our Director of Federal and State Relations. She'll start off with the 88th Legislature briefing, and then we'll move on to Mr. David Key with Energy Market Policy. Carrie, thank you so much.
All right. Good afternoon or good morning. I think we're still in morning. Thanks for having us back. And even though I'm the one up here talking today, I'm doing so on behalf of my team. We have Ken Whalen here, our Public Policy Communications Manager. Marie Stoner is on the WebEx. And then our Manager of Federal and State Relations, Christian, is taking a much needed vacation with his family. So to kick us off to talk about the legislative session, a lot happened and thankfully a lot didn't happen. And for the it's the legislative session is designed to kill bills, and in particular, this was a good reason or a good session for that to happen. So we're going to focus just today on the items of direct impact to CPS Energy, and then we'll talk a little bit about what happened, what the next steps are, and then I'll transition to David, who's going to talk about the ERCOT and PUC activities from here. So we had, and I apologize, I missed that slide, but y'all will probably recall that we had our public policy agenda focused on 3 buckets or 3 pillars, one being customer affordability and impacts, reliability and resiliency, and then MOU governance, utility governance. I'm going to focus on utility governance and reliability and resiliency, but with the understanding that customer impacts and costs are woven throughout. We looked through every bill with that at the forefront of our minds of what is going to be the ultimate impact to our customers and our utility. When it comes to the utility governance topic, this was probably one of the most difficult sessions we saw in terms of proposals that would have affected CPS Energy and our MOU business model. It's no surprise every session we do see bills that are not focused on CPS Energy, but the difference with this session was while these bills were not filed because of CPS Energy, they would have nonetheless impacted us. We saw primarily the focus being on the general fund transfer. How does that work? What's the relationship between an MOU and its city owner? How is it handled? And also vegetation management. How is that program handled at an MOU? And how does the general fund transfer play into that? Some really tense discussions, but we collaborated with our state association, Texas Public Power Association, as well as the city of San Antonio in order to successfully advocate and educate. And I say educate because I think a lot of the concern and the questions that we saw from legislative offices were based on just not having the full knowledge and understanding of how a general fund transfer works, how our process is set up, that we have a flow of funds, it's in our governing documents. And so there's sometimes, a fear of something that you don't really know. And we were able to successfully discuss how it is that we handle our programs here in San Antonio. And, ultimately at the end of the day, none of these bills passed, but we do expect that we'll see them again. And so part of our process or our work during the interim will be making sure that we're continuing to educate offices and help them take a deeper dive into some of these topics that they've not previously wanted to deep dive on. Come on. There we go. Okay, so moving to the next bucket on reliability and resiliency. This is what will be the focus for the rest of the presentation is the legislature was really focused on how to incentivize additional generation, specifically dispatchable or on-demand generation in the state. David will talk a little bit more about this, but as we previously discussed last fall, following a study that was done, the Public Utility Commission voted in support of the performance credit mechanism. The legislature said, hold up, wait, before you do anything, we need to be able to look at that, as well as think of our own ideas and have our own discussions about how we incentivize new generation. There were a lot of discussions, lots of proposals. At some point, it felt like, throwing spaghetti up on the wall, let's see what sticks. There were several bills that either had similar or identical proposals in them that were all kind of competing to be the front runner. At the end of the day, we saw 4 bills pass that focus on the grid. HB 1500, that started off as the Sunset Commission bill for the Public Utility Commission, ERCOT, and the Office of Public Utility Counsel. I think we had previously talked about this, that every state agency has to go through a review by the Sunset Commission every 12 years to determine, should you still exist? If so, how can we make you more efficient? What can you focus on to improve your operations? 1500 was the sunset bill, but at the end of the day, it also got all of the proposals that the legislature agreed to related to market design. And it turned into be a 50-page bill. So what we do see in that bill is the Public Utility Commission will continue to exist for 6 years. And all of the market design proposals are in there, and we'll get there in a second. The other item that they focused on is Senate Bill 2627 and Senate Joint Resolution 93. Those 2 bills create a statewide loan program for the building of new dispatchable generation. There's also a grant program in there for utilities outside of ERCOT, but it's roughly $10 billion that utilities can apply for in order to build. The joint resolution, since it's creating a new account using state money, it has to go to the voters for approval. So in November constitutional amendment election, you'll see an item on there. And then House Bill 5, it's basically the replacement for what used to be called the Chapter 313 tax credits and tax incentives. They passed a new version of it, and that includes some tax incentives, though not directly applicable to us. It does include tax incentives for the building of generation projects. And again here, like I mentioned earlier, we looked at every proposal in terms of what are the intended benefits versus the cost to the utility and ultimately our customers. Here we have, amongst all the bills that we just mentioned, a high-level overview of the main components of each. These are not all inclusive, but just the main ones, because these are the main areas where our team engaged and advocated on behalf of the utility. What we have here in green are the things that we worked on that we believe ultimately we are supportive and believe it's a positive outcome. The items in yellow are items either that passed not necessarily ideally how we supported them or that we are approaching from a neutral basis. And then the one item in red is an item that we had actively opposed that ultimately passed. But when it comes to the performance credit mechanism, there are guardrails. I think we've used that word with you all before. The legislature had said, you know, if the PCM is going to go forward, then we want to set some guardrails. We want to set some consumer protections. So the bill that they passed includes some of those guardrails and consumer protections. It also creates additional ancillary and reliability services, but at the same time says studies must be done on these things, on these various services, as well as the performance credit mechanism, requiring the PUC and ERCOT to undertake cost impact studies, as well as a study on cost allocation methodology. And that was a topic that I had to learn a lot about. But in current market structure, costs are allocated on a load ratio share basis. And at one point, the legislature wanted to create a new way to allocate costs to these programs that we believe, although it was intended to potentially, it was intended to discern or distinguish between dispatchable and non-dispatchable types of entities. We believe and we opposed it because it would have ultimately all trickled down and have an unfair impact on customers. So what the legislature did, they kind of came up with a middle of the road where the PUC has to study what is the best way to allocate costs for these programs to customers. Is it the current method of load ratio share, or is it a new type of method that we're looking at? So that's future action to come. And then up here also, there also is included at several points along the way, and David will talk a lot about this, there's going to be additional avenues for stakeholder input. These bills passed, but there's still a lot of work to be done at the PUC and at ERCOT, and we intend to carry those messages forward that we've been carrying in the legislative arena. These two yellow items, there is, and I'll have to look to David during his presentation to talk a bit more on this. There was a discussion on in the legislative arena as to whether or not there should be a cap on the performance credit mechanism program. And we were supportive of a price cap, but didn't think it was something that should be firm in statute. We supported it being something that could be more fluid, that would be determined by a PUC or ERCOT process. But the legislature ended up putting in a statutory cap of $1 billion. And then also the $10 billion loan and grant program, we have that there as yellow because we're still assessing the version of it that finally passed. I'll note that this bill was filed very late in the process and it all happened very quickly. So we are still internally assessing this to determine, do we think that this $10 billion price tag will yield the benefits to the grid, to our customers that it hopes to? And then there's also a number of provisions that we believe either penalize or exclude non-dispatchable resources, also known as renewables. Some of the ancillary and reliability programs that were created as part of the legislation are only for dispatchable resources, We maintained all along that any type of resource, whether you're dispatchable or non-dispatchable, if you can prove you can perform and participate in the program, you should be given the opportunity to do so. There's also going to be things in there in the future, firming requirements for resources to basically make sure that they have backup power. And although that's going to be applicable to all future new generation, it will, more significantly impact non-dispatchable resources. And then there's also a provision in there that requires there to be a cap on the interconnection costs of new generation. So right now, if a new generation source needs to connect to the system, that cost is sort of peanut buttered across everybody. Under this new process, then the Public Utility Commission will set a cap. And if a generation source goes over that cap, then they're going to be the ones responsible for whatever that amount is over. Supporters say that this is intended to incentivize generation to build closer to load, but we believe it unfairly and intentionally targets renewables, but also other types of generation that for a variety of reasons can't site near load, whether it be environmental requirements, urban growth limitations, a number of things why a generation source cannot site close to load, that we think this cap will unfairly impact that. That being said, the PUC is going to have to undertake a rulemaking process to set that cap. And so we intend to participate in that process. So more to come on that. Internal and external alignment. Yes, sir.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but excuse me, could we go back to the slide? The $10 billion amount, it says loan and grant. Did they say how much is going to be grant and how much is loan? Because I guess my concern is, if it was all loan, then we would assume at some point down the road it would get repaid. But if, the grants won't be. So I just wondered, did they just make some sort of determination between the two?
Yes, there is, I believe, 7.2 billion in the loan program. Then there is another 1-ish billion in a completion grant program. And then the remaining amount is a grant program for non-ERCOT utilities to modernize or help with their generation sources. I don't know, David, if you want to speak at all to the completion grant program. Okay, yeah, that's the dollar amounts are set forth in the legislation.
Okay, I just wondered because, you read the 1 billion and you think, well, that's how much tax money we're devoting to that, but really that's not the case. It's really more than that. So, okay. All
And
right.
the 10 billion is state money that theoretically is already there, that was part of their budget negotiations in how to use the surplus. So in terms of, I guess, quote unquote, kind of the idea of new money, that would be the $1 billion potentially of what the cost will be for the performance credit mechanism program. And I'm phoning a friend here because it seems like David's got some more intelligent things to add.
No, just based on the question, we're talking about the $1 billion cap. That's a market-wide impact of the pricing. So PCM is going to affect energy prices in the market. And the $10 billion loan program is how much money are they going to loan out? So there's two different dollars there, but that's what those are.
Yes, sir.
Related to that same question, so the loan and grant is applicable to the grid as well as energy sources, whether it's green or fossil? Because I remember reading something or hearing about in the news that the state was trying to incentivize fossil generation and de-incentivize the green generation. So can you speak a little about that or where that stands and how that ended up?
Yes, and I believe the loan program is only for dispatchable generators to either build new or help modernize current dispatchable generation. So they did make that clarification for dispatchable generation, what they consider on demand and not renewables. But yes, that was certainly a sentiment throughout the legislative session, was a concern that things that had happened at the federal level, the IRA, the IIJA, had tilted the scales too much to renewables, and that was going to create an instability and unreliability in ERCOT, and the state needed to counteract that by finding a way to help get more dispatchable generation on the grid. And then just real quick before I turn it over to David, our internal and external alignment, we had over 50 people internal, some who were in this room that helped us look at, we looked at every bill of impact to us from an operational, financial, and legal perspective. And that really helped to drive what kind of engagement we had, what kind of messaging we were doing up at the building. We also had numerous community and industry partners when it came to all of the market design conversations, working with all different groups of stakeholders within ERCOT. When it came to those MOU governance bills, working with our fellow MOUs in Texas Public Power Association, as well as the City of San Antonio. We registered official positions of support or opposition to bills, which is referred to as dropping a card. It's, you use an iPad now, but there used to physically be like a card that you would write your name, your company, are you for, against a bill, and do you want to testify? And so we still call it dropping a card, even though it's electronic now. And then filed verbal and written testimony. One of the plus sides of COVID was now members of the public have a way to submit written testimony. So we leveraged that opportunity as well. And here we just have some examples of that. Bills that we registered positions for. The written and verbal testimony, those three, the Senate Bill 7 and Senate Bill 2012 had to do with market design. And actually we have a screenshot here of Rudy, our president and CEO. He came up to Austin to testify in support of Senate Bill 2012, which at the time was the leading bill on market design, and a bunch of it got rolled into HB 1500. And then also we provided informal written comments and engaged in the stakeholder group throughout session. One of these random ones, I'll just note, HB 898, that increases the penalties for violating the move over, slow down law. Happy to report that got signed by the governor. And then in terms of next steps, internal post-session compliance process, internally with legal and compliance and the business units, we will go through every bill that impacts CPS Energy to make sure we are prepared to integrate the changes. Whether it's just a knowledge sharing or if it's implementing some sort of process, we will go through that formal process. Regulatory rulemakings, which David's about to get into. And then our chair had mentioned special sessions. So fingers crossed, we are not a subject of a special session, but the governor did, he called them back in for their first special session 2 hours after they adjourned their regular session. He stated that it was his intention to call several special sessions because of all of the work that the legislature didn't get done that they thought they needed to do. But his announcement included a list of accomplishments, and grid reform was one of the accomplishments. So at this point, it is his belief that what was passed that we just talked about was a success, and that they don't need to come back and address anything more when it comes to the grid or energy issues in general. His intent is more on education, property tax cuts, as we've seen. So no matter how many special sessions he calls, we hope it stays the case that it's not our topics, but we will continue to monitor every bill that's filed, even because members can file whatever they want. It's just not in order for it to be taken up. So we will still look at those bills and analyze them in case the governor wakes up one day and decides, you know what, I am going to add this topic to the call. We're already prepared and ready to go. And that is, I believe, my items on legislative activity, unless anybody has any questions on that. Yes, sir.
I'll always ask this question because I never hear or read anything about it. Is anything discussed or is any funding involved that's associated with long haul transmission and or energy storage facilities?
Not that funding sources or just in general.
Anything that encourages or assists in, like, for instance, I always read about, we're creating great wind energy in West Texas and we can't get it to where it's really needed because we don't have the transmission capability or the storage capability. And so, but I never read about that. It's all about, do we build gas-fired plants or not? That seems to be the whole, and it seems like there's other issues out there that could help us. I never hear about it.
So I do know that specifically, unfortunately, when it comes to things like the performance credit mechanism and some of the other reliability services that they passed, they specifically said that battery storage cannot participate. But we will go back and look at the loan program to see if battery storage, because that is still a conversation happening, is what is a battery considered? And so I don't think there was anything on that on a positive note that passed, but we'll go back and confirm.
I'll just add a little bit that at the legislature, there's not a whole lot of activity on transmission. The discussion that we've heard in hearings is that storage or batteries particularly, they don't need money. That's what they're hearing. That's what we're hearing. So that's what the attitude is. We are hearing at the PUC and at ERCOT that some of the commissioners, especially one of the commissioners on the commission, he used to be a transmission developer, so he's very interested, he's very engaged, and he's really trying to push for some reforms to basically just, I don't want to say shortcut the process, but to let the interconnection process, let the transmission build out process speed up. So there is a focus at the commission level, but really not at the state level. When we're talking about new legislation, I think the commission is really trying to work on getting more transmission built to look at, I don't know if they're really looking at wind, but I think they're looking at solar. And a lot of solar is going out in West Texas also. So there is some push there. It's just like to your point, it's not really televised or it's not really published very well because we're working on it kind of off in the weeds right now.
Anything else? All right, well, thanks. I'll turn it over to David, but available for questions.
Thanks, Carrie. All right, so I'm going the wrong way. So when we talk about what's happening so Carrie talked about the legislature, I'm focusing on kind of everything else that happens afterwards. My team really focuses on the Public Utility Commission and ERCOT. So really when we think about what's happening at the legislature, why are they doing these things? It's really because everybody's focused on the growth in the state. There's a lot of people moving to the state. There's a lot of businesses starting, businesses expanding. So there's just a whole lot of growth. And how do we keep up with that growth? So this really is trying to illustrate what folks are looking at and how they're kind of trying to address it. Carrie just talked about all the different things we had this legislative session. And on the energy side, it was really looking at the market. How do we make the market work to create new generation investment? So we have the PCM guardrails. How are we going to hold that program in? And talking about, whenever we talk about it right here, it says resource adequacy response. So how do we have enough generation to meet our demand? That's really what they're focusing on. And the last session back in 2021 was the first major energy session, probably since deregulation. They looked at, Winter Storm Uri response. How do we improve the reliability of the market? So they started with reliability. Now they're moving into the market. And hopefully this will be the last major energy session where they said, we've done enough. The governor is satisfied. Legislators are satisfied. We can move forward. So given that, PUC is trying to look at, well, how do we make this market better? Because the PUC ultimately oversees the market. And when they say better, how do we make sure that the very low cost renewable generation that's in the market doesn't push out the more dispatchable generation? I'll talk about more of that in a second. But they started off in response in 21, looking at reliability. So we had weatherization standards, looking at emergency operations procedures, things that were more reliability based. And then these past year and coming years, we're going to be talking more about markets. So that's what's happening at the commission. At ERCOT's a little bit different because they are the ones that are controlling the grid. They are telling generators what to do. They're telling transmission operators what to do. And basically they're making sure that all the power gets to all the communities out there. And so they've moved from a market-based, kind of let the market figure things out and work. They moved from that to a command and control based. And you see this acronym called a RUC. I mean, if you haven't heard that before, in industry terms, that's like a four-letter word, because basically it says the market isn't working. We need to turn on generators because the generators aren't turning themselves on. Problem that ERCOT is seeing is that prices are low because wind farms or solar farms are producing very cheap energy, and there's not enough energy in the market. There's not enough power prices to justify turning a generator on. And so that's what all of the fundamental market pricing changes are looking at, is how do we make the market such that ERCOT can get away from command and control and let the market work again? So there's a lot happening here and a lot of changes that are going on, trying to get people to basically answer that first question that first arrow says, how do we fix the grid? Because ultimately that's the problem that everybody has. If you ask each one of these different boxes, what's wrong with the grid, you'll get a different answer. But it's ultimately trying to figure out how do we address growth and make sure that the market works. And the worst people, the worst people in the position is the stakeholders, that last box. So folks like us, folks like other energy companies, they're the ones that have to operate under all of these changing rules. And if the legislature is changing laws, if the commission's changing rules, and if ERCOT's changing their posture, how do you make a decision? How do you make investments? How do you really do anything with a lot of this uncertainty? And so we're seeing that it's a very uncertain time. And it's actually not very common, I would say, for folks like us to come up with a generation plan like we did. So we're moving forward despite all this uncertainty. And the feedback we're getting from our stakeholders and our internal, folks is that, our generation plan is going to work for all the changes that we're seeing. So let's go ahead and move forward with that. So I think we're probably in a good spot for all of those things. Focusing on dispatchable, you've heard the term dispatchable. And I think, instead of going through the whole slide, I'll just say that dispatchable really means on demand. So how can we have a generator that will turn on and be ready to provide power when needed? It's really a generator that serves load and serves customers versus a generator that turns on and follows the sun or follows the wind. And so that's what the state is really focusing on. When they're ready to talk about dispatchable, they're talking about on-demand generation. And a lot of these activities that we see here are focused on that. Carrie did a good job talking about the PCM. If anybody ever has not heard about it, it's going to say basically PCM is a bonus program that pays generation extra revenues so that they can basically offset the lower prices that are in the market. But to Carrie's point earlier, the legislature says we're not really sure that is formulated correctly because they saw it as a blank check and they wanted to have some guardrails on that. So we did see some changes to kind of rein in that policy. Yvonne?
Thank you, David. Dr. Cantu has a question for you.
Sure.
Thank you. It was on the previous slide, slide number 10. I'm curious in the utility column and then ERCOT, it says weatherization. So does PUC set weatherization rules for all the utility companies, or are we talking about weatherization for ERCOT? And then ERCOT inspects all of the utilities?
That's right.
Okay,
That is
so
correct.
they have rules and regulations for weatherizations. Is ERCOT and utilizing those same rules in terms of looking at their equipment and it's weatherized? Just thinking about Winter Storm Uri and the issues that we had with the lack of weatherization of things at ERCOT. Thank you.
Great question. So when we talk about weatherization and weatherization rules, the PUC does set the rules, and then ERCOT does do the inspections. I will say that ERCOT doesn't actually do all of them themselves. They have hired third-party contractors, and that's part of it. And it's also for generation power plants and for transmission substations and major facilities. And I will say that ERCOT, their equipment that they actually own is relatively small. It's a lot of communications equipment. ERCOT doesn't own any infrastructure. That's all the utilities. But all the equipment out in the field that utilities own and operate is going to be inspected at some point. And there's a rotational program because I'm not sure that you can literally inspect every piece of equipment out there, but there is an inspection schedule set up so that we get to make sure everything is inspected regularly and ready for both summer and winter. Winter had been, before Winter Storm Uri, winter had not been a large concern from the PUC and ERCOT. But after Winter Storm Uri and all the legislation and requirements after that, all the rules are now basically all year rules. So we have to be ready for any kind of weather, both cold weather and hot weather.
So then one additional question, because then my understanding of what happened during Winter Storm Uri may not be what I have always thought, is that the issue was that the grid was not capable of operating in this freezing cold weather, and ERCOT wanted all of the utilities to decrease demand. So is this grid not an infrastructure that ERCOT is responsible for?
So the grid is the infrastructure that ERCOT manages.
Okay,
I would say that the utilities and the infrastructure owners are the utilities or are the power plant companies. They are the electric utilities. So they're the ones that are ultimately responsible.
okay.
And the commission and ERCOT basically hold all the utilities accountable to the requirements. I think that might answer your question, but if not, let me know.
Well, and I'm sorry to take up time. I just want to be sure I understand what happened. So the grid was not able to meet demand during the winter storm. And my understanding is because it had it not been weatherized for the freezing temperatures. So this brings the question is that ERCOT is inspecting, who is inspecting the grid and the weatherization of the grid?
Right. So yes, to your point, in Winter Storm Uri, there were various parts and pieces of the grid that didn't work.
Okay,
It's basically a domino effect that you start off at the gas well. There was some gas wells that weren't weatherized, so they shut off. You had super high demand, so now you don't have enough gas to run power plants. Some power plants reduce output. Now you don't have enough power to meet demand. So it was a lot of different parts and pieces that didn't work.
okay,
It's hard to say that, the grid is one thing that failed. There's millions of things out there that failed, but ultimately it was a domino effect that caused that issue.
okay. And so there's now a safety in terms of the inspections. This is meant to avoid this happening again.
Right. So there's,
Okay,
when you check a power plant for winterization or on either side, you check to make sure that
okay,
you can either remove all the heat so you can stay cool in the summer, or you can retain a bunch of heat so you can stay warm in the winter and your instrumentation doesn't freeze up and your power plant stays online. Same for
Right.
substations, make sure all the equipment works so that you can operate your switches and your reclosers and everything else that's out there to make sure that you can manage your operations. So there are policies and procedures in place to basically make sure that everybody in the state does that.
okay, and including ERCOT is operating under those same rules and regulations.
Right. So all of their equipment, all of their control equipment is going to be weatherized as much as it needs to be, and it should be able to do that. So I believe yes is the answer to your question.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry to take up time.
No worries.
Hey, David, this is Kathy. Dr. Cantu, I wanted to add one thing, if I might. And that is too, you're asking some really good questions. Power plants and transmission lines weren't ever inspected, at a state level like they are now. And CEOs actually have to sign letters of attestation to actually show that they are accountable to meeting all of the procedures. And I know Benny's on the WebEx here and can also add to that. But something I wanted to also reinforce is that on the electric side, there are a lot of new regulations. On the natural gas side, we believe there needs to be more. And what I mean by that is on the natural gas supplier side, suppliers still have maybe some different rules, and they're just, in our opinion, a little bit more relaxed. And we still, as CPS Energy and as the electric industry, we would also like to see a much more thorough and robust weatherization of their equipment as well. So that's something we're going to continue to work on and communicate, and I just wanted to insert that as well for information. Thank you.
And this is Carrie. I was going to add to that a couple of things. One, that this is kind of part two of the discussion that started with Uri. Uri being number one, first and foremost, how do we get our equipment to weatherize and be up to the task, whatever the weather conditions may be. And so the weatherization standards and rules and inspections is a result of Senate Bill 3 that passed last session. And now this market design discussion now is, okay, the legislature and the state have said, okay, we're we think we're in a good place in terms of making sure equipment on the grid is where it should be and it's ready to perform. Okay, now we need to get more generation on the grid and add to it. So this is sort of part two of the discussion. And you had also mentioned demand response, and I'll just put a quick plug in of throughout the legislative session, and we will continue this forward, is CPS Energy also believes that energy efficiency and demand response have a role to play in all of these market design discussions, that while you can be talking at and looking at ways to incentivize new generation, an energy efficiency and demand response have a role to play too, and we think that is a continued area for discussion and growth. So.
Perfect. Other questions?
Well, I'll let you get to the.
All right, yeah, I'll just kind of get through these really quickly. I can keep it very high level. So going back to the legislative discussion, when we take a step back, you try and figure out what exactly happened. House Bill 1500, like Carrie mentioned, was a sunset bill. We had, shotgun approach, spaghetti approach, however you want to call it. We had a lot of different ideas. None of them really passed, and they all got put in House Bill 1500. But when you look at ultimately what happened is when legislature was having hearings, when all the subcommittees were listening to folks, complain about what needs to be done to fix the grid, you heard three key issues. The first one was in operations. ERCOT and the independent market monitor, basically people that boots on the ground, know everything that's happening in the market, said we need more flexibility. So there was a portion of HB 1500 that said, let's create a new reliability service. Let's call it a dispatchable reserve reliability service. Let's have dispatchable on-demand generation ready to go on reserve. Let's have ERCOT figure out how to procure it. Let's have it in the market. Let's have it ready to go. So that's the first major one that came out of it. The second one was generators were complaining, we don't have enough revenues to sustain our operations, and so we have to retire our generators because they're non-economic. I can't run at a loss. And so that's where the PCM comes in. Let's raise revenues. The Senate says, or the legislature said, let's raise it, but let's raise it with some guardrails. And so that's where we have HB 1500, where the guardrails are in. They're basically saying, here, you're going to give you some extra money, but we're not going to let it be a blank check. And so they addressed revenues, because we will see an increase in revenues now based on this PCM guardrails if that moves through. And the last one was capital. Basically, generators said, I can't go out and get a loan anymore because the market is so risky. We can't make investments. Nobody's going to lend us money. So basically, they said, let's come up with a no or low interest loan program to let folks invest. So you have the ability to invest, get capital to sustain your revenues and to make sure that the grid runs in operation. So this is really the framework that we wound up with coming out of all of the different bills. And this is what we're looking at going forward. This is just a reminder. I believe we've seen this before. This kind of tells us where everything is, past, present, and future. Future looks like we're going to be seeing a lot of these changes in 2027 timeframe. That might move forward maybe a year or two based on how long it takes to get through, rulemakings and different procedure changes, different policy changes. So in this 2024 to 2027 timeframe, we're calling that the bridge year, and ERCOT's already taking steps to prepare by making changes to the energy markets. You see at the very top, it's underlined and in bold, it's called an ORDC adjustment. That's just a fancy acronym for saying there's going to be a small bonus payment, relatively small. It depends on your version of small, but there's going to be a bonus payment in the real-time market that will go to generators that will mimic what the PCM is going to do, but it doesn't fully do it the way that the legislature wants. So it's very much seen as a temporary bridge option. The purpose behind that is to keep generators from wanting to retire and incent generation to come online. So we're going to have probably the next 3 or 4 years, maybe even 5 years worth of a bridge before we can get to these larger changes. And so what does that look like going forward now that the legislature is done? There's going to be a ton of PUC rulemakings. We usually have 1 or 2 a year, back in the good old days, and that was a lot. Now we're having 8 or 10, and it's just, lots of things to happen. So lots of work to come on that. And as those start making their way through, we'll be happy to come back and talk about how they're moving through. Same with ERCOT rules and procedures. Once we're done with the rulemakings, we're going to move on to ERCOT to actually implement the rules into the market systems and get those all put into place. So that's where we're at. And Yvonne's telling me we're getting close, so we'll take maybe one more question. Yes.
I'm thinking of what's your 45-second elevator speech that summarizes the legislature. Obviously, they're incentivizing development of more gas-fired plants and what I also heard is they're disincentivizing incentivizing the renewables, solar and wind. Anything more on that last part? Are they really disincentivizing it, or are we just not giving it incentives that we used to?
So it depends on your political view because the legislature is highly political, and we saw a lot of that this legislative session. Everything was very politicized, and I would say that it is very much not really trying to punish renewables, but we're really trying to push on-demand dispatchable. And it really depends on how you want to look at that. You can see that as punishing renewables by giving more money to dispatchables or excluding renewables from participating in these bonus programs. But really, the legislature is trying to figure out how do we make people want to build generation here in the state? Generation that can be turned on, that can follow demand, and that can be ready to go and weatherized. And generation isn't cheap to build. And as the state grows, we're going to have less places to put generators. It's going to be harder to get permits. The EPA is coming up with new rules every day about how carbon is bad, and so all the generation they want to create is carbon based, and so there's going to be a lot of conflicts there. So a lot of politicization, a lot of conflicts there, and we're just kind of working through all that to see how best to help it. I think going through the process, we saw a lot of really bad stuff. Luckily, we were able to message. We went to multiple senators and representative offices and said, this is really bad. Let's kind of think about this way. And we saw maybe didn't move all the way fully to where we want, but they got off the really deep end and kind of came more towards the center. I wouldn't say they came fully towards the center, but they got off the deep end. So I would say it's probably a positive outlook given how bad things could have been. Sure.
Question on the rulemaking. Is that, I don't know how long it takes in Texas to go through rulemaking. Is it that bridge year 24 to 27, what you're speaking about, or?
Right. So PUC rulemaking just depends on, you have to take chunks out of the elephant. Basically, how do you eat the elephant? Take a chunk at a time. These big chunks that they're going to be taking are probably going to take, 6 months to a year, depending on how complicated it gets and how, intricate it gets. So at the PUC level, you could probably take 6 months to a year to go through a rulemaking process. You'll have multiple ones of those because it depends on which part of the program you're trying to build out. And then those go into the ERCOT process. And that, if we have good enough rules at the PUC level, it should take another 3 or 4 months to go through ERCOT. And it's really trying to get, make sure the computer control system will meet what they said at that level. So working through that's probably a 2-year process, but given the number that we're gonna have to go through, it's looking like 3 or 4. Right.
And some legislation, some sections will specify how quickly a rulemaking has to take place or when something should be implemented. And in other areas, it's silent. And so we typically see that the Public Utility Commission staff will put out a calendar at some point in the interim. Once they can digest everything they have to do, they'll put out a calendar to say, here's the order in which we're going to be undertaking all of these things, and here are the deadlines and timelines.
So in one of your slides, you had the PUC quick hits was the lower price cap. So for example, is that something immediate or something that has to go through rulemaking?
The PCM cost cap or the cap on new generation interconnection? That will have to go through PUC rulemaking. So the legislation said the PUC must establish a cap on the interconnection of generation sources. And now it's up to the PUC to determine what does that look like? How do we set that? Stakeholder input. It's basically the legislature typically they've set their vision, and then the PUC now has to go hammer out the details.
Well, thank you, Carrie and David, very much for this briefing. As you can tell, this is of huge interest to the committee and those of us here, with the utility. So we anticipate as the summer progresses, we might be asking you to come back and give us an update on what transpires. Chair Kelly, I do have a couple of announcements to make before you move into roundtable. Roundtable will need to be brief so that we can make sure that we have time for our last session. First of all, we did have 1 or 2 additional committee members join via WebEx, so we now have a quorum. So if you would like to ask the committee to approve the minutes from the May meeting, you may do so.
Yes, why don't we go ahead and do that so we don't get behind. I'll entertain a motion to approve the minutes from the last meeting. Okay, motion.
Second.
Okay, very good. All right. Thank you. That was Lawson and Steve. Okay. That's
All those
good.
in favor?
Right. Oh, yeah, all in favor. I was jumping to a conclusion there, wasn't I? Okay, so I think we've got that taken care of.
All right, and my second announcement before we move into roundtable, Chair Kelly, is that CPS Energy has recently had a new addition to our senior leadership team. We have a new Chief Strategy Officer. She was here earlier and she stepped out, so she may be stepping back in later. But I just want to mention that Elena Ball has returned to CPS Energy after a decade away. She comes back to us with 17 years of utility experience in both investor-owned and public power utilities, leading power generation, transmission distribution, and multiple business development initiatives. She previously served as the CEO for Fayetteville PWC in North Carolina and the Chief Operating Officer for El Paso Electric and Austin Energy, and most recently as the Senior Vice President of Power Delivery at Entergy. So again, we're very happy to welcome Elena Ball back to our leadership team. And like I say, if she pops back in later, I'll be sure to have her come up here and say hello. That is the conclusion of my announcements. You may now move into roundtable for just a few minutes before we move on to our final topic.
Okay. Yes, just quickly on the roundtable, we had started the process of kind of discussing improvement in our process for filling the at-large, 5 at-large positions. And we have had, I believe, 2 committee meetings or 1 committee meeting, Dinah, just 1. So the process has begun, but it's not something we have to rush. It's just something we need to work out and make sure that we've got a path forward over the next few years as we fill these 5 at-large positions. So anyway, I think that process is moving forward, and that's good news. So let's see. I don't think, do we have anything else that anybody would like to bring up?
On that same note, so what about Mary Dennis backfill? Has that happened or no?
We will be bringing Mr. Ehrenstein to the board on June 26th and recognizing Mary Dennis for her service at that time as well.
Right.
Okay, all right, cool.
Yeah. All right. Good question, Bob. Okay. Anything else, Yvonne? I'm not forgetting something that we need to touch on.
Articles maybe that you want to mention and the articles that you.
Yeah, we had some articles here out of the newspaper. I guess particularly the one today on the front page of the paper. Occasionally we try to bring those things to y'all's attention. I'm not sure how many of the 15 members on the CAC actually take the paper and read it every day. So, people don't all, everybody doesn't read the paper as much as they used to. So anyway, when we find interesting articles that are pertinent to the energy sector, we do try to provide those, not to overwhelm anybody with articles, but I thought this article today in today's paper was good. So Steve, thanks for bringing that to our attention. All right. I think at this point, since we really are behind the curve time-wise, let's go ahead. And I believe at this point, this is going to require us to go into executive session.
That is correct. So thank you for transitioning the committee to executive session. During this session, there will be no votes or decisions made. And at the conclusion of the executive session, the meeting will adjourn.
Okay. All right. So I guess we'll do the appropriate things electronically to move into the executive session. Thank you.